Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IPCC Pavilion. Today, we're going to talk about economics and policy analysis in the IPCC's upcoming report. And we have 5 distinguished panelists, which I'll introduce in pairs or in groups. And we're going to hear from a broad range of perspectives, and we'll ask a few questions of our panelists and then open it up to audience questions. But to get started, the first 2 panelists we have are authors that worked on the 6th assessment report, so the last report that came out. So we have Oliver Gedden and Frank Giozzo, who were authors on a cross-sectoral chapter and a national and subnational policy chapter. Then we have two members of government delegations. We have Teja Kanektar from the Indian delegation and Jolene Cook from the UK delegation. And then our last speaker will be Ramon Pix Madruga, who has been on the IPCC Bureau for a while. So we'll hear some perspectives from the Bureau view. But to get us started, let's start with Oliver.
All right, thank you very much for the very short introduction. My name is Oliver Gedden. I'm from Germany. I was an author in Chapter 12. My background is political anthropology, so I study policymakers' everyday lives and people in administration and how they conduct policymaking in practice. Maybe a couple of thoughts how it was done in policy assessment in AR6. There's a chapter on national and subnational actors and policymaking, including economic instruments. That's a chapter that Frank actually was in, so I'm not going to talk about that much on that, but also one on international cooperation. And my assessment is, while I really value what's in there, I think that these are great chapters. Not much of it shows up then in the actual SPM, which raises questions. Why exactly? Are they too textbook-like, for example? Are they not actionable? Should they be different? Could they be done different? But I think what both do in a very good way is dealing with the fact that in the social sciences, you don't quite have a culture for doing consensus-oriented assessments, because usually you have many schools of thought working in parallel. The people in these schools of thought talking much more to the people of the same school of thought working on other topics. So not necessarily getting quizzed on if their assessment of climate policy or other elements is the best one or is an appropriate one. So that makes it hard to bring this together in an IPCC context, where you also never are able to represent all these schools of thought. On top of that, of course, it comes context specifics in climate policy, in instrument, in framework conditions for governance. And this chapter took an approach of coming up with different framings, coming up with evaluation criteria. I think they're similar, quite similar in chapter 13 and 14 for policies and governance, and then having it all covered. But of course, it remains in the end quite abstract. And I think we always shy a little bit away in the IPCC, going too much into country specifics. And sometimes we may overgeneralize what actually are country or regional specifics, because the literature is clustered based on certain, for example, OECD countries. So, and a couple of thoughts what might be done differently in the next cycle is maybe work more with typologies of political systems and cultures. We start doing something like that in the report in the special report on cities. Maybe going towards a what works agenda in doing systematic evaluation and review. I think that Frank will talk more about that. And at least rethink whether there are other ways of integrating research and perspectives on policy making, but also on politics, into other strands of knowledge we have in the IPCC that usually get more uptake, like, for example, the scenarios work, the work on sectors, and bring in what political scientists or social scientists in a broader sense have to say on these issues. And of course, you create a trade-off. Sometimes academics like having their own niche more than having more influence maybe on chapters that have more uptake. But again, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the government representatives, the question is also since we are basically a service organization providing knowledge that should be actionable for governments, to governments, what is actually needed? Should we go for more differentiation, less differentiation, typologies? how to deal with these issues on policy making, but also on economic assessment, and that's what Frank is going to talk about now.
Yeah, thanks. And Frank, over to you.
Yeah, hi. So I was the lead author on the policy and institutions chapter in AR6 and carried some of that agenda in terms of the economic analysis and policy instrument analysis also in the SPM and the synthesis report. I think we can observe that policy analysis, including economic assessment, are obviously central to government interests in mitigation, right? I mean, what's the central question that tends to drive governments, right? How do we find economic prosperity in a world where climate change becomes more prominent and in a world where we're moving to net zero emission settings, right? And so it's all about really, the ways and means of economic success in a world that acts according to what the science says on climate change. Now, in AR6, I think we can say economic assessment is represented, right? But perhaps it's not overall as prominent as you might expect it would be, given the prominence of the issue with governments overall. Now, on policy assessment, Oliver already mentioned it. I think we're on a track towards increasing use of studies that actually do empirical ex post evaluation of the operation and success of and design of different policy instruments. That's great. I feel that needs to be continued, and we will be able to, because that literature is expanding, has been expanding. The analysis of economic effects, however, to date has still largely relied on modeling rather than actual observation, and that's certainly an area where I think AR7 will want to have a keen eye as to where's the emerging literature that actually does an ex post evaluation of economic effects of transition to low emissions settings. I would say, looking forward to AR7, there is certainly an opportunity to do more in terms of economic assessment of long-term trajectories, right? And so complementing the work that is there in terms of understanding the technological pathways with that question of how to achieve and maximize indeed economic prosperity in a world that acts on climate change, as distinct from the typical question that's really dominant throughout the literature as it's published still, of estimating the percentage loss in GDP relative to a business as usual scenario where the world does nothing on climate change, right? That is the question that naturally is posed in computable general equilibrium modeling, right? And it's not a question anymore that any policymaker I know of is actually interested in, right? The question that people ask is, when we act on climate change, how should we act on climate change in order to maximize economic opportunity? Now, of course, in all of this, it's not necessary and not desirable for the IPCC to make an overall call on which policy instrument is best economically or anything like that. I think we arrived actually in a reasonably good space in terms of the SPM and synthesis report, how that's reflected there. There's certainly a clear sense. There's horses for courses. Many different instruments are successful, right? And they depend on context, right? Now, perhaps to finish, some thoughts, much to discuss, of course, later on systematic review and what the role for that could be. I think it's clear that where it's suitable, systematic review, so machine learning-based assessment of very large number of papers, essentially, in studies, right, can usefully enhance and complement the overall qualitative analysis there. I do not think that it can replace that qualitative analysis and judgment for a number of reasons. I can go into one. One of them is, the possibility of a bias in the existing literature that's there, and so you don't want to just take a snapshot of the entire existing literature and say, well, that is the overall assessment, right? Because the focus needs to be on the emerging literatures, including, for example, on policies that support industrial decarbonization, right? The entire sort of new green industry policy, I think, will need assessing in AR7, and you'll need to go and search out the papers that actually treat that reasonably and give them emphasis. And of course, systematic review is best suited for research questions that are clearly defined and where a large number of papers actually address the exact same question, right? Then you can go and count, right? If it's more diversified and diffuse, right, then systematic review isn't really a tool of choice. Thanks.
Thank you, Frank. And now, as Oliver alluded to, the primary audience for our reports are government. So I do want to hear perspectives from both government representatives next.
Thank you, Kate. And I would sort of start off from where both of them left off. I think it's important to acknowledge that the IPCC, while a lot of it is viewed as reports on the physical science, on the state of climate, a large part of IPCC assessments are in the realm of social sciences, and it's becoming increasingly so now, given that we are in what we call the phase of implementation. So we are talking about mitigation and the impacts of mitigation policies. We are talking about adaptation and what that means, and that means we are talking about specific contexts. And unlike the physical sciences, in the social sciences, arriving at agreement, confidence, probabilities is a much more difficult exercise. So we are, when we say, and we were joking about this earlier, while you say the best available science, you can't really say the best available social science. I mean, if you go to a social science department and say there's something called the best available economics, you will be laughed out of the department. So it would be, or the best available sociology, for example. So it's something that we must take seriously when you're doing the IPCC reports. And the fact that there is a lot of economics that is actually elevated to the SPM, although it's not very clear in terms of that it is economics. For example, I mean, the scenarios are all based on a particular approach to economic thought, and they are all almost uniformly use one particular approach in economic theory. Perhaps it is the fault of economists. You don't have heterodox economists are latecomers to the climate debate. So you have the neoclassical variety really dominating the entire space. So in that sense, of course, you have that literature dominating it, but you have a particular view of economic futures represented in the SPM, and that's not necessarily in keeping with how governments view their own economic futures. Right? Is it Pareto optimality that we desire when we think about equitable and sustainable futures? Because every conversation that you hear in the rooms in the UNFCCC, for example, you will hear developing countries talk about distributive justice. But how is distributive justice operationalized in all of these climate models? Is it, in fact, operationalized at all? Because Pareto optimality does not talk about distributive justice in the global sense. That it is, you cannot make somebody better off by making somebody worse off. So then distributive justice is at the very outset not a part of the discussion. You have here, every conversation here is about developed and developing countries. You might have further categories of least developed countries, special circumstances, etc. But you don't see regional groupings. But almost all of the work on scenarios in the IPCC is based on geographical division of countries, whereas impacts are not necessarily determined by where you are located in terms of geography. Part of it is, but vulnerabilities are not distributed by geography. They are based on developmental levels, and yet you do not have that classification. For example, the only economic classification is reserved in the scenarios literature for the OECD. It's as if only the OECD are economies, then the rest of the world are basically geographies. And so if you actually take this literature and show it to somebody from an anthropology department, I mean, this is, for me, for example, it is colonial anthropology revisited in many different ways. And so you are going to have resistance to this kind of a view of the world, which is not something that developing countries see as important. And as the IPCC gets into this, and you have, of course, there are very good aspects of how assessments are done in the IPCC reports. There are discussions of equity. There are discussions of fairness in the IPCC reports. There's always a tussle about what gets elevated to the SPMs and not, and that's part of the process. but you have them only because you have certain authors that you might have there that are interested in it, right? So the IPCC also needs to think about how this becomes a part of the process itself. How is it that you can create structures, or you have a new bureau now that's starting off work? So perhaps thinking about how this becomes institutionalized in terms of how social sciences addressed or dealt with in the IPCC reports. How do you represent contestation, right? And how do you represent qualifiers? How when you present results that are based on economic assumptions, that are based on assumptions of social assumptions, that are based on things that are contested in nature, how is it that one represents agreement? How is it, agreement in the IPCC context, agreement in the literature, for example, or how does one sort of fix a confidence level for that kind of literature where you have a lot of contestation? What is you one There is, of course, some constraint in terms of how much you can get into, how many qualifiers you can put in. But I think on some of these issues, unless one decides that that is something that must be done, we will keep having the same conversations over and over again. So I think it is a good start that we are having this conversation at the beginning of the AR7 cycle, that this is an issue that needs to be sort of handled and discussed. Its scenarios is one part of the story, but you also have this sort of binary, right, of while there's qualitative assessment and quantitative assessment, and the fact that you want to see numbers or you don't want to see numbers. I think that kind of conversation is not very helpful. The real world is not divided in such clear lines. It's not even divided in clear disciplinary lines. So we need both to a certain extent. But how is it that one does assessments of sort of context-specific issues and then elevates it to studies? And one, I think, example is systematic reviews. But again, I mean, I agree with all the caution for sort of machine learning based reviews that were raised, because you do see a lot of bias in the literature. There is much more literature coming from developed countries. I think this is another issue, that there are vast differences in perspectives. Especially you take the cities report that is coming out, or how is it that we think of the urban space is very, very different in the global north as compared to in, let's say, in large parts of the global south. There's a very different perspective in Asia. So how is it that you do a framing of urban systems becomes a critical question in some of these things. And there is going to be, for some time at least, more literature coming from the global north. There are more capacities. Right, but then going beyond simply looking at climate literature, but there is a lot of urban literature that's not directly related to climate, but talks about urban systems, moving towards sustainability and things like that. That's just one example. Is something that perhaps can be thought of, and maybe thinking about diversity of authors, not just in terms of regional representation, but also in terms of going beyond simply authors that are recognized as those working on climate change, but getting authors who work on urban systems and on issues of or urban questions that might fit, but may not necessarily be known as authors who are from, have worked on climate change. I think that especially in some of these newer areas, especially in the social sciences, it is necessary, because you don't have as much engagement of social scientists, and this is true across the north and the south in the IPCC process that you do of scientists. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Jolene.
Okay, thank you very much. And already some really interesting and great useful points have been made. I mean, maybe it was just sort of drawing on some of these. I think fundamentally what we're trying to achieve with the AR7 is looking ahead to where we're going to be at the end of this decade. What is the information that the policymakers are really going to need to inform our decisions at that point? And it's not just about, obviously, it's about understanding what the risks we're going to be facing at that point, but also critically, how can the world start limiting warming to 1.5 degrees as close as possible? How can we adapt to the worsening impacts of climate change? How can we support climate resilient development? So for us, for Working Group 3, it's really about how can it produce information on actionable solutions that in tandem with like the sustainable development and adaptation world, which for us is really about helping decision makers understand what has already worked, for example, why, and how that might be built into the future. So I think I've heard a lot of good suggestions already, but maybe I just draw on a couple of things on that. So in my notes, I've kind of called it, the first thing is about how do things fit together? And I think it draws on a lot of these things that people have made already. The idea of systems, a systems perspective, and this idea of drawing across many, many different disciplines. So how can we explore solutions that work for and simultaneously address a number of societal priorities to understand how we all contribute to the global goals? And so that might be, combining or looking at how actions on mitigation might help those on adaptation and where the trade-offs and co-benefits might be, actions across sectors and countries, and how choices, for example, in one sector might impact on another or across countries, etc. But also the issue of across time as well. What do we do in the near term, and how might that affect what's possible and what needs to be done in the future? Now, a lot of this stuff, at a national level, some of this already happens in what we do, and you can look on the ground to practitioners. I would say very much. You already start bringing some of this information together. And if you talk to them, it's clear that it's, I think you said, it's not just about quantitative and qualitative. It's both are needed together, both useful for different elements. For example, for us, quantitative would be very much in thinking about our targets or assessments, or looking at our own emissions. The qualitative stuff would be really about thinking about risks and how we might respond to that. But I think in order to understand this kind of menu of options that we need, information across all those disciplines, how they're using it in their economic and policy assessments is going to be absolutely critical. And to do that, they're really going to need very good tools and methodologies to assess this across a number of different scenarios, which I think probably brings me on to the second point, which is, best available science as provided in the IPCC isn't just about facts, it's also about those methodologies and approaches. So the IPCC already does produce methodology reports, but the Working Group 3 can also do this. So to give a few examples, we can look at assessment of how to approach key issues in decision making. One approach that we quite often taken in economic assessment is around cost-benefit analysis. For example, very frequently used. What it might be useful for the IPCC to look at is providing a sort of recommendations on the best guidance or best approach on how to do that in an appropriate and robust way, for example. In the UK, we've been refining our approach to CBA in our own policy analysis. What we might need to explore a bit further is how do we capture some of those non-economic losses and benefits into this in the way that we haven't so far. The other thing in this, thinking about economic analysis, policy assessment, how do we approach our decision making under deep uncertainty, for example? When there's all these enormous risks, that when we're discussing issues around tipping points, how does that captured in economic analysis? No, it's really not done so well. So we might be something about developing a portfolio of methods that delivers the maximum it can for across the widest range of societal priorities. And then I guess relating to that is the idea of maybe taking a risk approach rather than alongside your traditional CBA approach, looking at risks and opportunities instead, and looking at framing around that. So, for example, we might need to think, when you're thinking about your net zero plan, how can you ensure that your net zero plan is also resilient and aware of the risks that are facing us as well? In the UK, we have so the department I come from, we have a research program called Climate Services for a Net Zero Resilient World, and that looks at risks and how you might approach those in a number of different sectors, for example, on water. I guess, well, we've mentioned a few other bits and pieces here. I just wanted to touch on, we talked about systematic review as being one example of way of bringing this information together, and this is going to be very important. But the IPCC is also often asked to deliver all things to everyone, right? And it can't possibly do that. It can't provide information specific to every city or country. But it can examine a really wide range of climate policies in different contexts. One of the things we have been talking about, and it's great to see that the city special report will be doing this as well, is, can we start talking about case studies, for example, showing what has and hasn't worked, and most important, why they have worked to help. And this would apply across a range of things, including the economic approaches, the different ways of policy assessments. So I think I would agree that what Tejo was just mentioning about the need to bring in things all together. What's going to be critical is that can the authors, and with help, I assume, find ways of doing scientific, like an assessment to bring it, that we can assess across the traditional ways in which we approach some of these things, so scenarios, as in the IMs, with some of the other approaches as well. And it's going to be a very tough thing, but ultimately we're looking to have a very diverse and inclusive IPCC this cycle, and I think we really can do it with a lot of people working together.
Great. Thank you. Ramon.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Working Group 3 Bureau and the leadership to Oliver, Kate, for the invitation to this event. I could say that previous intervention has been very enlightening in calling attention on real challenges of Working Group 3 and the IPCC in making the assessment, and has been the case during the history of the IPCC and still remains being challenges. With regard, in general, I would say that my first call would be in terms of having a balanced report, thinking in two things, two key things. First, the balance of the report, and secondly, the relevance for the users of this report, even beyond the national governments. Of course, national governments are the first user of this report, but we have also state or province governments, local government, that also for them the report is supposed to be useful and relevant. And this is another key issue. So, for instance, even in terms of the purpose of an exercise like this, I could say toward a robust and balanced economic and policy assessment, because necessarily we have to have this as a target. With regard to policy, I would say that the IPCC in its history has been including policies, the assessment of policies, as part of the content of the report. And indeed, this is very important, but this has been very sensible, because the IPCC is supposed to assess policies without being policy prescriptive. And this in itself is a sensitive issue. Up to now, has been, I could say, successful, although there have been gaps that have been already mentioned that necessarily needs more further work in terms of refining, in terms of being much more inclusive, more inclusive in terms of the different disciplines that were already mentioned, and that in capturing the whole range, or to the extent possible, the representative range of views, of point of view with regard to all of these critical issues. And with regard to the economic consideration, the economic assessment, also to take into account that there are also non-economic issues that need to be taken care of. Non-economic impacts, non-economic consideration that cannot be measured in terms of monetary units, and also are very relevant for decision making at all levels, at all the instances. In general, Working Group 3 is the work of Working Group 3 is really challenging. It's extremely challenging because of all of these sensitivities, the relevance for policy, probably too relevant for policymakers, and that makes sensitivity even much more, an issue. And there are some other aspects here that I would like to mention very quick. The importance of the integration across the different chapters of the report, of the contribution of the working group, is crucial. How to avoid what was said at the very beginning, the textbook approach, these kind of things. I mean, having a well articulated from the very beginning of the three blocks, including, let's say, for instance, introductory chapter, sectoral and policy chapter. This is crucial, having this flow properly integrated. The regional treatment that was already mentioned that need much more elaboration and consideration. The treatment of the scenarios and the equity consideration needed in this process. As well as the consistency with other working groups. At the moment, there is a structural dialogue. Oriented to try to prepare conditions in this direction. The connection between bottom-up and top-down approaches, how to better interconnect this analysis in the system, in the exercise. Also, the risk. You also mentioned opportunities, the risk framework associated not only to the risk of climate change, but also to the risks, potential risks associated to the responses to climate change in terms both of mitigation and adaptation. In case of working group 3, in terms of mitigation, and crucial, something that was explored further in the previous assessment, but I will encourage doing that again and better in this new exercise, which is better consideration of the demand side mitigation issues. The demand side consideration that is also very, very important. And to conclude, being consistent as part of this effort for being much more balanced of the increasing diversity of actors in the climate action in terms of evaluating or considering the user needs, considering this increasing diversity of actors, and also the inclusiveness of the process in terms of the expert and also the contents, the need, for instance, as has been already said, of much more inclusion of social sciences representatives. The IPCC is the mandate include to assess the whole range of possibility when there are conflicting issues and when there are scientific polemic with regard to a specific aspect. Also, the consideration of knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities, and in general, the diversity of form of knowledge or a school of thought that were already mentioned, how to properly have at the end a report which is really balanced. It is not supposed to be an encyclopedia. We are not supposed to find there each and everything in relation to every region, every country. It's a global exercise, of course, with a regional and national inputs and also subnational input, but it's a kind of reference probably for other institutions, and has been the case for other institutions to further work in a specific assessment or report that could complement the IPCC at the regional level, at sub-regional level, and at national level. These are more or less the ideas, but I could insist in what I said at the beginning: balance and user needs to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think just following on that, balance and user needs, I want to follow up on something that a lot of you hinted at, and this is about this diversity of perspectives within the communities and the literature. So it's not just different disciplines within the social sciences, it's also different schools of thoughts within each discipline, quantitative, qualitative, somewhere in between. And I want to sort of follow up and try to understand, is IPCC, our role is to assess the literature and to provide information that's relevant to policymakers and include within that an assessment of, how confident are we in this? What do we know and how confident are we in what we know? And so what I might ask is, starting with our author experts, what is possible in this realm, and how can we bring together all of this diversity of literature, both given, what can be done in the IPCC and what is needed in the literature to enable that? And then I'll turn to our government representatives to talk about a little bit what would be useful, what would help you given this diversity. So, Frank.
Yeah, I think we find it is occasionally difficult to strike the balance between, the IPCC being at the forefront of what's actually of interest to the world, to policymakers, and on the other hand, representing the totality and the balance of what's in the academic literature, right? Because the academic literature, in particular, in its bulk, tends to lag the issues that emerge on climate change by a fair bit, actually, right? So, you mentioned disciplinary approaches, right? There's journals that people like to publish in, that publish a certain kind of methodology over another, or a certain approach that is established, right, dominates the literature that's there, but that may really not be the cutting edge of what's actually useful useful to be at the core of the IPCC assessment, right? And so I think it is incumbent on the design of the assessment report, and is especially incumbent on the authors and the chapter leads to actually search out the areas of the literature that are most useful to be reflected in the assessment. I think that's what it boils down to. I think many different aspects of these types of assessments that exist in the literature, but that are not necessarily dominant in the academic literature. We're mentioning a panel discussion here before, right? And so I think that's what needs to be done. And I guess that's a task to an extent for the scoping meeting as well that's coming up, in order to to have a clear-eyed view as to what needs to be represented. And then it comes to that question: to what extent the IPCC as an institution can actually encourage that research to be done in a timely fashion, so it can be reflected in peer-reviewed, peer-assessed, and published literature in time to be there for AR7.
Yeah, to add on that, and sorry that I'm sitting in the back, but I was told I'm sitting in front of the camera. So I think, first of all, to give a fundamental answer, as social scientists like to do, I think this is actually a valid research question that should also be looked at, how other assessments are actually doing this, how large research projects are doing this, because you have some where this is brought together in a better way. So in Europe, under Horizon Europe, you have some where they had a concept of bridging analytical approaches without trying then to quantify everything, so you can bring it into modeling, for example. But that might even be harder than to do if you only assess literature, how to bring it together. I think that, of course, we need to pre-select what are the really important questions, and then we also need to research empirically in an empirical orientation. Of course, we need analytical tools, but I always feel a little bit uneasy when we now say we need to bring in more practitioners. For what exactly? Because we're not don't we have literature that is actually analyzing what's going on? Because we have more and more climate policy making and governance. We have experience with decarbonization of sectors. We have also experience of failures. But bringing in practitioners sounds like, okay, the scientists don't get it done. Now they need to ask the practitioners. I think the literature should be robust vis-a-vis practitioners' perspectives. Still, we should try to find ways for exchanges in that sense. And I think what we may try, but again, that, as Frank said, well, the scoping meeting will decide, integrate more on the chapter level in the IPCC, and not have so much, let's say, clear distinctions via methodologies, and then chapters talk about the same thing in different ways, and it's then hard to bring it together, even with a technical summary, even more so in a summary for policymakers, because you don't own it as an author team. So I think it's a little bit unfortunate that you often get the feeling, okay, chapter X things, chapter 3 is not doing it correctly in the right way, and then there is really no way for communication, and this chapter describes it that way and that chapter describes it that way. So you really have to provide room for internal contestation, even either by bringing people together in certain chapters, or if they're not, beyond that, probably both, because you cannot bring everybody together in all relevant questions.
Thank you. Teja or Jolene, do you want to take the government perspective from this?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed perspective, both perhaps government and academic. But I think it's perhaps time to, given the discussions that we've had now in AR6 and post AR6, it's time to perhaps ask whether traditional ways of doing things, of either economic assessment or assessment of mitigation, emissions targets, etc., are really fit for purpose. Because you are, you have, since the 1.5 degree special report, you have language in the IPCC reports that talks about the need for transformational change and radical change. Right? But when you look at the quantitative assessments, what do you see? Do you see that radical and transformational change? What you see essentially is fantastical, sometimes technology optimism, but a deep economic pessimism. Right? So you have no vision of how an economic future would look like. So that continues as is. But within that economic future, you can somehow magically achieve radical technology transformation. And so there is a contradiction there, which sits very uncomfortably. Very often with with academics from developing countries, but even governments from developing countries. The scenarios is sort of perhaps the most striking example of this, but it is true across other aspects of the assessment as well. So you have something as critical as food security, for example. And the way in which it is discussed. There is a long discussion in the IPCC Working Group 3 report of AR6 on food security that says very clearly that you have the stringent 1.5 degrees Celsius targets, in fact, increases risk of hunger and increases food insecurity across the world. Now, this is an important thing to tell so if you have to parse it out and our governments read this, what you're basically saying is that all the targets that you have in the GST outcome, the 43 degrees reduction and the 60 degrees reduction by 2035, etc., underlying it is increasing food insecurity for our part of the world. That is a very difficult message to convey without talking about why is it that we end up with this result here. And none of those qualifiers make it to the SPM, right? So it is, I think, and when you talk to the modelers, they tell you, oh, this is addressed post-processing outside of the model, right? Because what we are interested in is the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. But the Paris Agreement is not just Article 2.1, it's also Article 2.2. So you have to talk about the implementation of Article 2 in its entirety. That is what, for example, the Indian government would like to see. How is it that you meet goals of sustainable development? How is it that you meet the climate and temperature targets of the Paris Agreement on the basis of equity and sustainable development? So on the basis of equity and CBDRRC, but none of that gets space in the literature. So you have, I mean, there is space in the literature. There isn't, of course, it's not necessarily elevated to the SPM. So I think there's this question of whether the literature lags cutting edge questions that are emerging on climate. The IPCC also, as an institution, needs to decide whether the traditional methods of economic assessment that it has relied on are really fit for purpose for the kind of questions that are emerging now in the time of in the era of implementation, especially the kind of questions that developing country governments are in fact asking. Where is sustainable development in all of this? Why is it that none of the scenarios that are there in the global scenarios in the AR6 meet the sustainable development goals? Those are critical for us, right? So are we going to address and answer some of those questions? And I don't have, unfortunately, an answer for how you're going to do that, Kate. But there is, I think, an important conversation that needs to be had there. And so just one other point of, I think there has been a lot of discussion on how is it that you include knowledge and perspectives from the global south. This becomes even more difficult in terms of including questions of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge or those things in the because what you have as a process of assessment is not really something that can very easily match because you don't have you will have, for example, people studying indigenous knowledge, but that is again in some form you would raise sort of questions of whether it is really a contribution of indigenous knowledge to the assessment, or it is sort of a colonial understanding of indigenous knowledge that then can get published in papers, which then gets picked up by the IPCC assessment. So how is it that contradiction would be avoided is an important question, I think, that the Bureau needs to perhaps think about when they're including these issues. But I do think that we need to quite seriously think about how we are going to redress this balance about an economic sort of blinders in terms of an economic vision of the future that was there very much in the AR6, but somehow a very rosy picture in terms of a technology future for the world. And these two don't reconcile. But how is it that you are going to address some of that in AR7, I think is a real question.
Thank you. Jolene.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, absolutely, diversity of perspectives is going to be critical this cycle, right? I think the first thing I just wanted to do is just recognise that, you know, what the approach that has been taken in the IPCC so far has led to enormous major milestones, I would say, in informing climate action. So I certainly wouldn't want to, you know, discount what has been done before as completely not worthy of having driven action on climate change. And I think it still has a role to play in the AR7, but we do, you know, as has been highlighted, we do have to recognise that there is an evolving landscape that the IPCC is delivering, and it's, if we want to talk about how people can do, or how countries and local communities can act, it has to be appropriate to what they can do. So, yeah, absolutely critical to capture that diversity. I guess a few thoughts then. So firstly, you know, we've talked about scenarios. We heard a little bit about the you know, the issue of equity and how that's going to be brought into this. I guess, I mean, ultimately, it's all about ensuring a livable future for our citizens. Is that not what we're trying to do? And you know, a livable, safe future for our citizens, I think, is what we're trying to achieve. So, I guess my question would be: does the average person on the street experience national GDP? I would say probably not, as you know, we might suggest. You know, what they do experience is things like: do they have clean air to breathe for them and their children? Do they have green space for their mental well-being? Do they have access to clean water? Do they have like sufficient and reliable source of energy for their lighting or their cooking or for their work or anything? So, you know, noting that you know, there's inequity, but within countries as well, I wouldn't say GDP is necessarily a great indicator of what the poorest and most vulnerable in countries are experiencing. So, I mean, certainly when we start looking at scenarios, I would suggest that different dimensions of equity are brought into this as well, which I guess brings into the, you know, I think you mentioned this gets onto your point about, you know, food security, the risk of trade-offs between things. It's absolutely important that we start looking at those and linking them all together, as you know, the point I was making earlier about how do things fit together? How do we ensure that the choices we make in policy making isn't necessarily the sort of biggest, shiniest one you might want to do because it achieves emissions reductions, but it's one that will achieve the maximum benefits across a whole wide range of priorities. So, yeah, I completely agree on that. The second one is, you know, this scenarios and how do you bring in different types of data into this? I think a number of us have been chatting a while about the need to develop, for want of a better way of putting it, the science of assessing scenarios, if you like. You know, so how do we understand when we're bringing in something that's away from your traditional, say, integrated assessment model and thing? How can you relate the two? How can you understand how they fit together or don't fit together? How can we understand what the limitations of every approach is? You know, how can we understand, you know, what conditions certain findings hold, if you like? So certainly there's something about developing that methodology for comparing those. So I agree with that. And just on the other types of knowledge, is something we have talked a lot about in the IPCC, indigenous and local knowledge and other types of knowledge. And I think the IPCC, together with the biodiversity equivalent, is hoping to hold a workshop on that. And I hope that might yield some information on that and provide a bit of guidance.
Thanks. And I want to turn to Ramon, but first, for those that don't know Ramon, he was co-chair of Working Group 3 in AR5, Working Group 3 vice chair in AR6, and is now an IPCC vice chair. And so he's seen this evolve over 15 plus years. So I wonder if you could offer your perspective on this question, given that.
Well, I'm going to be brief, taking as reference previous intervention. As I mentioned before, this issue of the need to be more balanced. I mean, probably 100% balance. Something is not possible, but much more balance. I would say that there is room for that. And with regard to the need of users, I would like to go deeper in this second part, and has to do with the need to be much more connected to the development issues in general. And this is relevant not only for the developing country, but also for developed country, their perspective, how to really root the assessment, take into account the development agenda, how to connect. The case of the Sustainable Development Goals is part of this picture, but even going further, because we know that probably these goals are still limited in many aspects, and going further on and this is valid even for the chapter dealing with the subnational priorities and so on, how to better connect with I mean the decision makers or policy makers in the case of the national governments. In the previous panel that we had here in this same room, there was a question in that regard. But we are producing too many reports. But what happened with how to connect this with real life, with the development agenda? What are the and this has to do, of course, on how to communicate the results. Of course, this is the second part. But first, let's produce something that is relevant in that area, and then let better communicate these results. And even I recall that you mentioned the previous assessment, even this issue was treated as development, equity, and sustainability to call the attention into this part of the agenda. And indeed, yeah, I understand that there are some of the proposals that the current leadership of the IPCC is putting on the table, that it has to do, for instance, with being much more participatory in terms of including the indigenous and local knowledge and so on. Of course, there are challenging issues in this regard, but my view is trying to see to what extent really we can progress in that direction. I'm optimist in this regard, because I think that there is a lot of information, knowledge, and wisdom in this kind of knowledge that could be taken care of as part of the assessment and oriented in this direction I mentioned, this direction of development and social issues. Yes.
Thank you, Ramon. Well, I do want to take some questions from the audience. So if people have questions, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone, and I might ask that you introduce yourself and let us know if you have a particular speaker you'd like to answer your question. So questions for our panelists. Right here. Oh. Anyone? Jesse.
Hello, Jessie O'Reilly, Indiana University. Thank you. This is really fascinating. I've learned a lot. My question is about, there's been a lot of, and it's general to everyone, there's been a lot of recommendations about bringing in expertise. And my question, that expertise is really bringing in people and authors in different disciplines, different kinds of knowledge holders. May have different ways of working in a chapter or in kind of a potentially high conflict or high contestation sort of situation. So I'm wondering what the IPCC's ideas are for facilitating work in different among people from different communities of practice to have a good assessment experience and then ultimately effective assessment. Thanks.
Does anyone like to start?
Question for the IPCC.
Maybe Ramon, Oliver.
Yeah. Well, I would say that there are many. There are always options in this. In that sense, I'm going to refer specifically to one that was, in my view, successful in the case of Working Group 3 in previous assessment, particularly the previous one that has to do with targeted review processes. During the review processes of the IPCC has 2 rounds of review of the draft. And during this draft process, some communities were identified as target for a specific review, and was the case, for instance, of environmental organizations and business organizations. The intention now, as part of this more inclusiveness approach, is trying to open the window not only for environmental and businesses, but also for other organizations, including farmers, trade unions, and so on, that at the moment are being briefed. The IPCC has been briefing them with regard to the next steps in AR5 and so on. But this is one specific area of action. The second one is encouraging this broad representation of actors involved in the climate action that now are many more, as I said at the beginning, to encourage them to apply as observer organizations that give the possibility of being much more involved with the IPCC activities. To nominate experts is crucial, being part of the nomination process, and these are two channels through which a specific community could be much more involved in the inside process of the IPCC, or involved to the IPCC from the inside.
So being not only in political anthropologist, but having worked in government several times via secondment, and also being in the institute that is funded through government to advise policymakers in government and parliament, I'm a little bit skeptical about, let's say, the sum of expectations being fueled in the beginning. Also thinking about the principles and procedures of the IPCC that still have the focus on scientific, if not peer-reviewed literature, and certain forms of gray literature, and also knowing that, or wanting to highlight that the IPCC mandate is a little bit different from the IPES mandate, as the UNFCCC is a little bit different from the CBD. So I think we need to invest a lot of effort to find out how best to do that. So the chair, for example, announced already his intention to hold an expert meeting on additional ways of assessing knowledge for IPCC report. It will bring very different strands together, but including the issue where IPES has a lot of experience how to ways of including indigenous knowledge, for example. I already said that with practitioners, I would tend to say forming task groups, maybe more involving UNFCCC constituencies, could be a way, I think, in the end. And according to principal procedures, and having now attended several business plenaries as bureau member, knowing how hard it will be to change rules, I would say we also need to prioritize to not overpromise. Organizations tend to overpromise, and we know that in studying them. But I think then a lot of effort needs to be put into bringing together the people that are selected, and that is hopefully a more diverse group, and also helping them overcome challenges. I mean, we always say, yeah, they're all doing this voluntarily, and they do. And we're creating much more work if we want to have internal contestation and not people let assess the literature they already, let's say, it's coming out of the communities they already work in. That's definitely much more work, and we will also find out along the way if it's realistic. But you also have to prioritize that during the process. Maybe also different ways of doing, again, internal and external reviews, going beyond the usual, okay, there's a call for expert review, and then we deal with all these single comments, maybe also testing that certain constituencies, what we're actually doing. But again, I think this is a learning process, and probably it will not finish then in AR7, and we need to document what we have done so that people in the next cycle can learn from that as well. I think that's something we always have this deep experience, and then it somehow gets lost, and people try to reinvent the wheel, not knowing what has been done. Yeah, maybe in AR6 because the people are around, but AR5, AR4, AR3, and 2. If you read through report, just skip through report, you will find that even in the second assessment report, many of these issues are already highlighted, like, for example, equity. So, and then you can ask yourself, why exactly are we going in circles? Are we really going in circles, or is it the same overall topic, but we have improved here and there? I think this learning from own experience as an organization also needs to be improved.
Thank you for that. I think we had another question up front. And Ramon sends his apologies. He had to run to another commitment.
Thank you so much. I think we have IPCC representatives here. No? Okay, thank you. Sorry. So one point, actually, I would probably reiterate what the government representative mentioned about IPCC's ability to capture diverse perspectives and that data that is coming from diverse sectors and diverse sections. One thing is to be able to capture so that the reports give adequate representation to the facts that are around the world. That should eventually inform the policy. So one thing I would like to mention that we have been doing. My name is Hari Krishna. I work for Help Age International. Therefore, obviously, I would say this point that there are a lot of studies that are indicating that by 2050 the world will be the older. That means that more than 60% of the world population will be 60 plus. Similarly, there are a lot of new facts are coming up, and how IPCC would capture this new data, new realities, and obviously these facts have to influence the policies at the international and the national level. So that's one point, and what policies, what practices you would implement so that you will get much more diverse data from different sources. That's number one. That's number two. To the national governments, my question is that what is your experience in terms of using data which is not science-based? We have a lot of science-based data that actually dominates the discussions at the international level. What has been your experience in using IPCC reports which are not science-based? To what extent you have been able to use them in your policy making? Thank you so much.
I don't know who. I think there was a question for maybe Oliver and then a question for Teja and Jolene in there.
So Tishal has a little more time to think about the question. I think we already have been in the process of selecting participants for scoping meetings for the cities report, but also now for the upcoming Working Group 1, 2, 3 scoping meeting Kuala Lumpur, and we're in the process of selecting authors for the cities report after the outline. And I think quite some effort went into, let's say, first of all, broadening the base you can actually choose from. So I think the activity to making the authorship more diverse starts in addressing people in organizations that usually would not think that they're even eligible for it. Even in addressing, let's say, social scientists in the global north and in the global south, thinking, yeah, where's my connection to the IPCC? I will not apply or let myself get nominated because I don't stand a chance at all. At the same time, then you have to deal with potential disappointment, because if you get approached and people tell you, yeah, you should yourself get nominated, and then you get not in again, but that's a trade-off you have to live with. So I think others would need to assess, when you see then the list, did we really do a better job or not? Because I will not now say we did a better job than the ones before us. But I think that is the first step, to go out via national focal points, via constituency organizations of the UNFCCC, via observer organizations of the IPCC, and say, okay, bring in the nominations. But then for the Kuala Lumpur scoping meeting, you have 10 times the nominations than slots. Then at least do webinars with the people not selected. Let them bring in the perspectives in terms of learning, have a webinar with the coordinating lead authors of the last report to talk about experience. And then once you have a more diverse set, get the people socialized into the IPCC, because otherwise, let's say, the incumbent still will have an advantage in knowing their ways. So a lot of investment needs to go in that. And the plan right now is, if we get government approval on the yet to be produced outline draft in February, then have a longer phase than usual until the first lead author meeting. So the selection will start early, but then again, providing support for the authors selected before the first lead author.
Thank you. To Jolene or Teja, second question.
Uh, Yeah, so just for the question on, I mean, I'm sure the IPCC Bureau is thinking about it in terms of what it is that they can do to address some of these issues. But I think one of the issues is also some form of insularity in the IPCC authorship that seems to have sort of, been there now for some time. So you need to see how that needs to change. And one issue that did crop up quite significantly is the question of, especially in some disciplines, it's much more pronounced in some disciplines than it is in others, or some chapters than it is in others, where you have the same authors, the people who have papers in these areas are the IPCC authors, and so their assessment of what they have themselves published is highly unlikely to be critical. And they are also on editorial boards of journals in which those papers are published. So I think there's a bit of a issue. It's not something that the IPCC can solve by itself. So you should not also take on all the burden of solving all the problems of scientific assessment in the world. It has to be a collective effort across multiple institutions and governments, but this is an issue. And wherever, at least in chapters that it has been much more pronounced in AR6, is something that the AR7 Bureau must look at correcting, perhaps. That is one. I think the other thing is, I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that which IPCC not based on science. That is not the issue. But I think there is a tendency to think of certain issues as normative in nature, others which are more quantitative, etc., or can be quantified as scientific in nature. I think that binary is a bit of a problem, right? Equity is not normative, and one of the issues, I think, the shift from the second assessment report to the sixth assessment report is this: you have equity much more front and central when the convention is the sort of leading sort of treaty or agreement in the way in which we discuss climate change. And now, of course, the entire idea is that the Paris Agreement somehow, I mean, we think of it as the Paris Agreement is to enhance the implementation of the convention. So it is part of it is under the convention, but there is a view that the Paris Agreement is now a new agreement. And so there, of course, the way in which you deal with equity is very different. So that's why you also see this influence, in my opinion, the IPCC reports and the way in which equity is handled inside the IPCC reports. You see a shift. What we would like is a shift back as governments, right? So there is obviously going to be that contestation. So the fact that equity is, you think of certain issues as normative and other things as scientific, I think is the issue, because otherwise then you would say that social science is not science if everything that social science deals with is normative. But inequality is a fact of life. The differences in incomes across developed and developing countries, the differences in incomes within countries, all of it, the fact that there are huge differences in energy consumption, huge differences in access to infrastructure, is a fact, is a measurable fact. So it's not as if somehow this is some normative consideration that you impose from outside. And I think those kinds of issues must be much more frankly dealt with in the IPCC reports. One of the issues, I think, is also that it is an intergovernmental panel. So there is governmental, sort of, I wouldn't say influence, but of course, intervention and perspectives that do, shape the way in which IPCC reports take shape. But scientists themselves also have some kind of have to have some view of what it is that the IPCC does. So is the IPCC's role to tell governments what they want to hear, or is the IPCC's role to tell governments what they ought to hear? I think that is something that the IPCC must really decide. So how much do you let sort of those interests shape the way in which science is assessed, versus what it is that science, both the physical science and social science, must tell governments in the context of climate change? I think that is something that I would sort of see.
Thank you. Julie?
Yeah, thank you. No, just on the question about experience of using data in policy making that's not science based. I mean, I guess the first thing I would say that in policy making, evidence is a range of things. It's not just like your traditional, say, climate science modeling and things like. To do robust policy making, you need to consider obviously your science. Fundamental climate science or whatever else. You need to consider your economics. You need to do public consultations. You need to do behavior insights. Maybe you want to also looking at best practice of what's been done before. And there is already a lot of experience in doing this, within government policy makings, or even recognizing Oliver's point about the practitioners in the IPCC, but practitioners do have experience of drawing all these different things for doing on the ground action. So this is not something that's new at all. And decision makers, they have to weigh up all these considerations to form your final, understand what way forward. So there is a lot of experience out there already. It's not a new thing. We just have to work out whether we get that into the IPCC. And just coming back to the thing I was saying earlier, that it can't do everything for everyone, but what it could do is highlight case studies that might be relevant to different contexts that people can draw on, look at, see if it's relevant to them or not, or take what they need from it, maybe get in touch with the people who did those case studies or something. But just as a kind of supplement to the main assessment that the IPCC is responsible for.
Thank you. Other questions right here.
Thanks for this great discussion. I'm sorry I came in late, so maybe some of this was discussed earlier, but I just want to reflect on what I've heard in the last half an hour or so, in particular around the sort of development climate intersection. I'm speaking as somebody who's sort of wrestled with this as an IPCC author. And so just a couple of reflections. I mean, one is that, as Tejal said, so the food security issue did get a fair bit of attention. And I think the IPCC does play that important role of saying, look, there are these implications of certain types of emissions trajectories and particularly sort of very, very sharp 1.5 trajectories and so on and so forth. So it makes its way in. The SPM process ends up reducing some of the stuff, and we all know the dynamics of that as to why that's challenging. But it's not like these questions don't get raised. The question is, why do they not? Why do they seem like they're muted? And to my mind, there's two or three reasons that I at least observe from my experience. I mean, the first is this kind of fallacy of false concreteness, right? You get into Herman Daly's phrase. You get these emission scenarios. They're just one chapter, but they end up dominating AR5 even more, AR6 a bit less, because they look so concrete and tangible, whereas a lot of the other issues are less quantifiable, they're more diffuse. And then the second part of it is that if you're looking at development considerations, it's not a unitary thing like emissions. We've reduced them down to SDGs, but even those are, whatever, how many, 16 of them or whatever it is that they are. But it's also multiple contexts. That development story is different in different contexts. So you can't tell a single unitary narrative that can suffuse the whole report. So it's a narrative building exercise that's very challenging. The third dimension of it is actually, I think, different sets of perspectives between authors from the developing world and perhaps reflected in global academia from the developing world, right? So one perspective might be, given that development is so important, and given that we are in a world where we're seeing climate impacts, how do we bring a conversation that brings these two things together? What do low carbon, climate resilient pathways look like? Can you achieve development while reducing carbon? Can you achieve development while becoming more resilient? We now need to integrate these two questions. That's one perspective. The other perspective says, look, the IPCC is a political process, and maybe if we start talking about ways in which we could do this, and there isn't going to be means of implementation support, we should actually be defending the space to develop in the way that we think and deal with mitigation later. So that develop now, mitigation later kind of perspective actually then becomes very difficult to mesh with the low carbon, climate resilient development as a single challenge taken together. And so those focused on development actually end up being diffused and dividing their voices. And it makes it harder to actually come up with a narrative. I mean, I'll put my cards down. I'm very much in the camp of those who say we have to figure out ways to develop that we can't have development that's innocent of climate change anymore, which doesn't mean we forego development, but we need to be much smarter about it and thinks about other ways of doing it. So these are all reasons why I think we haven't cracked this nut. I think AR6 was better than AR5. I haven't gone all the way back, though I am very interested in how you get anthropologists into government. It's not been my experience. So that's something I would welcome a side comment on. But I'd welcome reflections on this from the panel.
Yeah, maybe we'll start with Oliver.
How do you get?
So first to introduce Navros, he was actually leading the policy chapter in AR6. And we had great words at the beginning that you did not hear, how good it was, but that the uptake in the SPM was not that comprehensive, which is then part of the problem. Only on the point of indicators, and I think it refers to something Tijal also mentioned. Of course, you could construct scenarios, and the IM community would not disagree, that reflects more on certain issues like food security, other equity-related indicators, and then you could produce what we called illustrative mitigation pathways alongside certain criteria, because the illustrative mitigation pathways we had on top of the whole database was just then structured via temperature levels, but they were the IMPs, but they only talked about, or the focus was on different ways of getting emissions reduced to certain levels. And I think getting other considerations in there, splitting up, for example, temperature levels or doing the IMPs differently is certainly possible, because I feel little if you only put the caveat in the SPM, in the end, it's still only the number that will get reported if your caveat does not change the number. And this is not to blame the IM community. Policymakers and the media just love these numbers. So, and if you read, I recently read in preparation of the AR7 scoping meeting, the AR5 scenarios chapter, and I was surprised how much I liked it because it has many of these caveats. Then they are not in the SPM anymore, and then they're not getting reported in the media because it's just the numbers, maybe the range. But I think improvement could be done even in the way we have clustered scenarios now by bringing non-emissions foci into the clustering. But that does not answer all the other questions you raised, and I think probably Teja will have to say something on that.
Does anyone else?
You don't have to, but we can start with Julene as well.
No, I mean, we did discuss some of the other chapters before you came in, and so that was important. I don't think the question is so much of, I don't think any government anymore is saying that you can be ignorant of climate while you talk of development. I don't think that's part of any government's policies. Everybody is talking about contributions. Everybody has an NDC. So you are talking about climate action, right? The question is, I think in the scientific literature, how is it that are the IIMs capable of doing this fully? If not the IIMs, is there other literature that does it? And how is it that we reflect it in IPCC assessments? The IIMs perhaps play a role. I mean, when I said whether they're fit for purpose, one has to decide what questions they answer and what questions they don't answer. But what questions they don't answer must be very clearly specified. There shouldn't be an assumption that IIMs can answer all questions. And the problem is that the way in which things have developed post AR6, post the criticisms of the IIMs have become much more vocal, is that the IIM communities are also sort of trying to address some of the equity questions in their own ways. But there might be opinions out there that think that the IIMs cannot answer them in the way that we would want them to be answered, right? So some of this has to be perhaps taken on board, and you have a much broader modeling literature. You have a much broader mitigation assessment literature that is quantitative, qualitative, but also goes beyond the IIMs. And how is it that you do that is your headache and your headache, Oliver. So that is one thing. But I don't think this sort of development versus climate is any longer a serious question in the policy realm. Everybody thinks that, of course, people are worried that you are. I mean, governments are worried. Governments of the developing countries are worried, and rightly so, that your space to develop is going to get curtailed because you don't see any action from the other side of the table. Right, you have constantly seen a lack of progress. You see no progress in the means of implementation. This is what we are experiencing in this COP as well. And so you do see this happening, and so you are afraid that the less carbon space there is, the higher the mitigation burden is on you, and so you need to sort of protect your space for development. That is, of course, and I would say that that's a very, very valid concern coming from some of the poorest parts of the world. So, but that doesn't mean that these governments are therefore saying we will not contribute to climate action. In fact, everybody is perhaps doing far more than their fair share. But how is it that is captured in the way in which academic literature is produced? And I think the part of the weakness is also about how we do that, those kinds of studies in the global south numbers. It's not just, of course, and we are very focused, we're very inwardly focused. One of the drawbacks of higher capacities in developed countries is that they can come and study us, but we can't go and study them. So we end up spending a lot of time studying ourselves, and we don't get the same kind of space that they do in the IPCC reports.
On the economic side of things, we do need an economics that deeply understands the future possibilities for economic prosperity in a world that might look quite radically different, with climate change impacts, with the rise of technologies like AI, with the general economic rise of industrializing and developing countries. We're talking long-term scenarios, and we do not have a good handle on what economic prosperity and what economically desirable societies look like. That needs to be encouraged in the academic sphere, in the think tank sphere, for that to emerge, right? Equally, we need much more emphasis on deeply founded analysis on distributional issues, right? So we talked about in our panel just how important equity is, right? We need that more strongly reflected in the research literature, in the modeling literature as well, to understand what are the likely effects on income distribution, on cost of living, of the energy transition, of the industrial transition, and so forth, and how that can be addressed in terms of policy instruments. We need to encourage more literature on that. And when it comes to representation in the IPCC, I think we don't get around the fact that the number wins today in terms of external representation. And to my mind, the way to go about that is to present more of the synthetic findings in numerical terms, right? So, complement the representation of IM scenarios that lend themselves so beautifully to, charts with lines and numbers and all of that, that complement that with something similar that's easy for take up in the media, that's easy and attractive for policymakers to look at, that you're tempted to copy and paste onto your slide into your next presentation, that actually represent some of the more qualitative insights in numerical terms in some way, right? So hunt down the number and make it the hook for the deeper insights.
Thank you. Jolina, Ramon, you want to add anything there?
No, I mean, for me, not really much. I mean, it's kind of what I was saying at the beginning, really, about this need to really stop considering things in isolation and really look at the links between, adaptation, mitigation, resilience. They all, ultimately, they're all going to get mixed up as we move quite further into this sort of very climate changed world. So not much more to say than that.
Well, I think we are unfortunately out of time. So I do want to thank all of our panelists. I think this is a really interesting and diverse set of inputs, and sort of focusing on this, bringing together more than just one thing, whether it's more than one discipline, more than one government priority. And also, I think one of the other things that kind of came up throughout this was there's a difference between the literature, the IPCC assessment, and then the communication of that and how it gets into the real world. And I think that's something we need to think about throughout, is that what we might think we're saying may not be what is being heard. And so trying to think about that throughout. So I do want to thank all 5 of our panelists, and thank you all for attending. And as you might have picked up on, this is part of an effort throughout the AR7 cycle to be more inclusive and to hear more perspectives and to have these conversations up front before we start writing. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you should be on.